Hi, good afternoon and or good morning, depending on where you are watching around the world. Welcome to the live webinar with the American Tinnitus Association. Today we're going to be exploring biomarkers in tinnitus. What is a biomarker? Why does it matter? And a really exciting study that's exploring those very same questions. Today is the very last day of Tinnitus Awareness Week 2025 and part of the American Tinnitus Association's mission. We're a public charity, 501c3, and we have a charitable purpose to silence tinnitus. A big part of that mission is advocacy, and that's what today and this week is all about, Tinnitus Awareness Week. So today we're excited to have an incredibly exciting topic, including biomarkers, and we are honored to have with us Dr. Becky Lewis from all the way over in San Francisco. Welcome, Becky. Thanks for hosting us today.
Of course. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And so Becky has graciously, she's a tremendous volunteer of the ATA, tremendous advocate in the world of tinnitus. We're all very lucky to have her. I serve as the CEO for the American Tinnitus Association. I consider myself a patient advocate. I've had tinnitus myself since I was 18 years old after some chemotherapy treatments as a cancer patient. And so I'm honored to be the person in charge of the ATA today. And Becky is one of our leading volunteers and advocates. So thanks for having us, Becky. And then I'm going to bring everyone else on stage real quick and really hand it over to you to help lead today's discussion.
Sounds great. Yeah, let's bring on the team.
Dr. Fatima, good to see you. And I think we've got everyone here. So I will kick it over to you, Becky, to get things started.
Great. Yeah. And thanks for the warm introduction. I'm really excited to learn more about this project and kind of tinnitus biomarkers, where we stand today. I want to start just by introducing ourselves. My name is Becky Lewis. I'm at UCSF over in San Francisco. I'm chief of audiology there. And I see a lot of patients with tinnitus, but I'm not currently really working on research in tinnitus. So I'm really excited to talk to all of you about what you're working on, and especially this project that you're all working on together. I'll first introduce Dr. Fatima Hussein. She is a wonderful researcher and clinician who's been very active in actually a variety of spaces. Oh, I'm sorry. You are a researcher, but a diagnostician is what I remember. So I'll pause here. Dr. Hussein, did you want to just tell us a little bit about your current work and areas of focus? And actually, I'm sorry, I'll pause. It seems like we have a little bit of a microphone issue. Let's see.
Dr. Fatima, you might be muted. I'm not sure if your mic is connected. I can't hear Christopher's muted, so I can unmute Christopher.
Yeah,
there we
go. Perfect.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll turn it over to Chris really quick here, and then yeah, it's always kind of getting some of these audio components together can be tricky. So thanks for your patience, everybody. I'll toss it over to Chris. Chris, I know that you also have been very active in the field of tinnitus research for quite some time. Do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of what brought you here and your current work, and then we'll kind of talk more about the TIDE project specifically in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I've had tinnitus myself since my 20s because of a blast injury, so not the same as Patrick, but that also motivated me to go into the field. I did a PhD on something completely different, but 2009 I decided to tackle that, and I went to the States, started working on animal models, and it was very hard, in fact, to convince people and their research community that you can measure tinnitus in animals. This is strange because people have been doing schizophrenia research in rats and mice for more than 40 years without questioning that at all. And so breaking into the field was tricky. And when I moved to Sweden and opened up my lab there, that's when I started being interested in how to do that research in humans. Part of it was biomarkers, like genetic biomarkers, in severe tinnitus. We can talk about that later. But then also those objective biomarkers to quantify tinnitus severity, and to try to see if we can measure improvements in patients. So I've been part of the advisory board at the ATA for some years, because I also view that communication with the patient community is very important. In parallel, I've been also involved with the Tinnitus UK, so former British Tinnitus Association, that was during my transit time in Europe, where we continue being active there. So yeah, I'm here today because it's important to share my relationship with patient organization is part of the duty, and it's important to mention what we're doing.
I love that, and I could not agree more. It's absolutely critical that we bring actually of what we're doing in the labs back to patients and the public. So I love to hear that. That's great. Um, I'll turn it over to Dr. Campbell. I know that you have been working in the tinnitus area for some time. You're also an audiologist who sees patients. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what got you here and kind of your work with the ATA so far?
Sure. My background has been working in hearing loss, and particularly in children with hearing loss, and how that affects the development of the auditory part of the brain. And so my training was in that and looking at how both the auditory and the visual systems change in response to hearing loss. And from there, I became very interested in tinnitus, and I have started looking at different biomarkers and different possible processing points of the auditory system. And yeah, we've been graciously funded by the ATA to look at a gating system to see how that might differ in tinnitus. And now part of the Rainwater Foundation for this large biomarker study. So just really excited and grateful to be here. I also see patients at University of Texas at Austin Speech and Hearing Center. I work with misophonia, hyperacusis as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here, a lot of translation to the clinic that's needed. And so this is an exciting step.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I love to hear also the different backgrounds that you both have, coming from animal work, coming from more of a pediatric population. And something they both have in common is they can't always reliably tell you what's going on. So a biomarker can be really helpful for that. I'll come back to Dr. Fatima Hussein. Do you want to introduce yourself here?
We will try. Is this working?
Excellent. It's perfect.
Okay. We just had to turn it off and on again, but
Love it.
it always works.
Yes.
So I'm very excited to be here. I've been associated with ATA for more than 10 years. I think I started around 2014 or so, serving as part of their scientific advisory board, and then I chaired it for a while till about 2 years ago. So this has been such an important part of our journey in understanding tinnitus. So this is, I guess, the premier advocacy and patient support and research support organization in US. So we are very extremely grateful for ATA and all that they do. So my background is as a neuroscientist who was studying speech and hearing, but not necessarily tinnitus. And it's close to now 20 years that I've been studying tinnitus. And it started with a family member having sudden onset, chronic, continuous tinnitus, often bothersome. And I started learning more and more about it, and I became interested in it. And so I've been doing a lot with always focused on adult humans, just to differentiate myself from the others in the panel, and focusing on the neural networks or what is happening in the brain when someone has chronic tinnitus. And it seems that in the past 6 months, I've also developed some tinnitus, but that's okay. This is like, we study it and then we get to live it as well. So that's very interesting. And I'm very happy to be part of this panel and to tell you about our latest studies funded by Dr. Amy Rommel's charitable foundation that she is the scientific advisory officer of.
Yes. And that's such a great segue. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. And it's great to hear also about your extensive work. I know you've done so much, and especially the cognitive neuroscience area. So that's wonderful. And you were just about to kind of introduce Dr. Rommel. We want to just thank you for being here as well. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about your organization and what role you play here?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for inviting me on this. I was just planning on cheering on our amazing scientists, but yeah, so I'm the scientific program director at Rainwater Charitable Foundation. And, our foundation supports family economic stability programs, but then on the other side of which I serve is the medical research side, where we support things like tauopathy research in the frontotemporal dementia and progressive supranuclear palsy space, as well as brain cancer and tinnitus, obviously, which is why we are here. And my background's actually in biochemistry and genetics and brain cancer. So when I joined the foundation, I found it really fun to be a part of so many different programs. And I would say that this whole program is something that is supported by one of our trustees, Todd Rainwater, who is incredibly enthusiastic about the research of the investigators you're about to hear from. And so, yeah, we're just super grateful to be here. And we know the power of this work. A little bit of history, and then I'll let you guys get to the fun stuff. But initially, when we got into the tinnitus space, we were looking for a fantastic treatment that just needed to be accelerated into clinical trials. And we thought that's what we needed to do. But it turns out you can't even measure tinnitus quantitatively. So how on earth can we figure out if something's truly working in clinical trials? And that's ultimately what led us to these, it's actually a total of 7 brilliant investigators. We have 3 of them here, where they think that they can quantitatively measure tinnitus for the first time, which would just be a game changer for clinical trials. So again, thank you for having us on here, and thank you to the investigators for sharing your weekend time.
Yeah, no, I also have to thank everyone for being here. I think we're all looking forward to learning more about this. And you had, again, such a great segue. This is just setting itself up very nicely. Everyone started talking about, kind of the nature of this project you're working on together, maybe why a biomarker is important, and how, tinnitus maybe can't be objectively kind of measured at this point. We have kind of the first question for today, which I will turn over to all of you. Can you tell us a little bit about this TIDE project that you are all working on, and what does it have to do with biomarkers, and why would developing an objective way to diagnose tinnitus be important? I'm happy to kind of open up the floor to whoever is most interested in kicking off that question.
Well, I don't mind doing it because it's been part of the history of the TIDE project and its creation. In fact, we were first contacted by the Rainwater Charitable Foundation, who wanted to try to figure out who could potentially know what would be the thing to do, the drug to test. That's what Amy was mentioning before. And funnily enough, I receive about hundreds of emails from patients per day of people that are really complaining and worried about what's going to happen. I cannot give them answers to all of them. So this type of occasion is perfect for that purpose. But I also got an email from Rainwater that was asking a lot about what's going on and so on. And I thought, oh gosh, it's another email that I cannot process. So I put it in my special folder on the side and forgot about it. Then I get a second email in my second institution, same thing. It said, oh gosh, this person must be really, really bothered about it. And I did the same mistake, just put it on my box there on the side. And finally, he managed to contact me again in my other email that I have as a editor-in-chief at Jarrow. And so I look and take a deep look at it, and then I weight the importance of that email. So we get in contact, and they, after a discussion, they propose us to submit a letter of intent. And coincidentally, 2 weeks after, I learned from another colleague, Winfried Lee, that they were also asked to do so. So we were both of us competing for potentially a grant, and we were proposing the same kind of things. They had a paradigm that they thought could be quantifying tinnitus, and we had the same. and say, why don't we just merge efforts? We shouldn't compete together. Just let's work together. Let's join our teams and propose to, if we have patients enrolled in, we test 2 paradigms at the same time, and then we assess, which one is best, or can we use both of them, and so on. And the team started building up like that. And Winfrey's area, it was joined with Regensburg and Zurich, but also Ghent in Belgium, and then also Dublin in Ireland. So the thing started growing like that. And then Rainwater thought, well, if we want something that works to be really implemented right away, we should also seek to do it in the States, because then it might get NIH approval. And if it does, then that can be used straight ahead, with testing drugs or devices and so on. And that's how the teams from Julia and Fatima came in to complement the whole project with 7 different sites, 5 in Europe and 2 in the States. And so, biomarkers and why, I'll do that briefly. Since 2014, when I was introduced to clinical work, so work with humans, after I had done my work with animal models. So we were questioning aspects like genetics. Is there something in there? Is there a biomarker that can tag tinnitus? And it took us until 2 years ago to find the first markers that are reliably found in different populations and that are tagged with severe tinnitus, because that's another problem. It's not all phenotypes are measurable or can be tagged with a marker. But genetics cannot quantify tinnitus. It measures whether, there is a likelihood that it's there or not. So it's not the same. This can be helpful if you want to stratify people. There's been work with, for instance, diabetes. They, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And in fact, there are 5 different subtypes that can be classified with genetic biomarkers. And some of them are responsive to some drug treatments and others not. So you can use the genetics to be able to orientate different patient groups towards a treatment. If there is a treatment, then it's always the catch-22. The treatment has to come while you have a biomarker at the same time, and this is the complicated problem. So in parallel, we were thinking about measuring tinnitus objectively, having something that you can quantify and measure this as tinnitus is severe. And if you have an improvement, ideally, you want tinnitus to be gone. Everybody wants that. But already an improvement is an indication that a drug or a molecule or a device has an effect that's independent of a psychological questionnaire that is now the current tool that has been used, to current instrument that is used in the field. So maybe Fatima or Julia want to comment on what I've just mentioned.
Maybe I can start by giving the definition. So that TIDE stands for tinnitus detection. So that's the acronym we've come up with, and it's detecting and devising sort of this robust manner of telling when someone has tinnitus or not, right? So a lot of us have tinnitus. We know that very personally, but it's very difficult for someone who is not that person to understand it, to have that experience validated. And as we've discussed, to figure out when a treatment is working or when it is not working, right? And so for a clinician and for a researcher, that's very important, but this is not to take away from the fact that people do have tinnitus. We are using this as a means to also validate the experience someone has. And this has been sort of this big quest, or this holy grail of tinnitus research for a very long time, to come up with this objective biomarkers. So to go off what Chris said, so something like diabetes or hypertension, we do have some markers, right? But in a lot of other conditions like major depressive disorder, we don't technically have any of these markers. So not to just pick on tinnitus, but there are a whole slew of conditions that do not have a very strong objective marker that someone can just do a blood test and say, oh, you got this or you got that. And what that does, it facilitates treatment, it facilitates the validation of someone's experience, and it facilitates perhaps even our path towards a cure, right? How do we get to that point? So there has been efforts made in very sporadic fashion in different labs, going back decades, right? Going back 4 decades even. So this is not in the sense that people haven't thought about it. We have all thought about it, and even before I was born, perhaps, right? And I'm already old. So this is what the innovation of we had to be at a current time in science and research for us to do this. We have different strands coming together and saying we have something that we can do in a cost-effective fashion. Let's research that. Let's research that in several different labs and bring all this large data set together. And we want to develop this very robust biomarker, right? That's part of the innovation. This couldn't have occurred, let's say, 10 years ago. We are in a moment of time when this is in a way possible, and we are again. It shows the Rainwater Charitable Foundation's vision that they said that this is where we need to be. So it's sort of an intersection of many different important strands that are all coming together at the right time at the right place, so to speak. And we are very optimistic about it. And one of the ways we are looking at, one of the important distinctions here compared to different other such projects, is that we are focusing on using EEG as the tool of choice. And this is important, right? So I use MRI, which can be very expensive, but we are talking about using something that is available in a clinic, in an audiologist clinic, in a neurologist clinic, even in your family practice. Medical doctor may have access to EEG, and this is something that eventually can be deployed there. And I know that Dr. Campbell, for instance, has done a ton of research going back from her PhD, and she's done a lot of work looking at event-related potentials and EEG, and maybe I will now throw it out to Dr. Campbell.
Thank you. Yeah, so just to quickly comment again on the importance of a biomarker, we know that tinnitus is very heterogeneous. So lots of different etiologies, lots of different percepts of the actual phantom sound. And having a biomarker is helpful, or having several biomarkers to determine where the issue is in the system. And then that can give us our targeted intervention. So a big plus of this study is that we're not just looking at one system or process of perception. We're looking at 2 different systems. So Chris is heading up one paradigm that's targeting, looking to see if there's a sensitivity to EEG and tinnitus perception. And then Dr. Van Est, who's not here, is heading up another one. So we're having a multi-pronged approach to determine, what process might be contributing to the tinnitus percept, how sensitive is it, and in what patients could we pick up this oscillation in the EEG. So I really think that's a strength of the study. Like Fatima was saying, EEG is so wonderful. It's super cost effective. It has a fast translational time to the clinic, which we love because we haven't seen a lot of movement clinically in a very long time for our tinnitus patients, which is frustrating, I think, for everybody. And our audiologists are already trained in how to do these measures. So we wouldn't have a whole training delay for this. We can use our current systems, we can use our current audiologists, and so we have a really good pipeline to have this active clinically.
And I wonder if you could tell us also a little more about what EEG kind of is, what it looks like how is it that audiologists know how to do this type of measure, and why is that type of infrastructure, really important to be able to kind of scale this out over time?
Sure. EEG is wonderful. It's great because it's non-invasive. So what we do is we put some sensors or like sticky pads on the head and present a stimulus, and your brain does the work. So that's another plus of the approaches that we're using in this study is we're looking at obligatory evoked potentials, meaning we don't need the patient or the participant to respond to what they're hearing. It's already automatic in their brain. So we can pick up on these oscillations in the brain in response to the stimulus or stimuli that we're presenting. And that's great for many reasons. It's great for kids. It's great for people who aren't able to give us responses to what they're hearing. Very objective. So we have stickers on the head. The person sits, relaxes, doesn't do anything, hears some sounds, and we're able to look at different patterns through signal processing, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. And that's pretty much it. It's really, really nice system.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. And actually, I think kind of feeding off of that question, I know artificial intelligence is, getting stronger every day, can do more and more. And I understand that you all are using AI to actually help you analyze some of the brain activity. Can you tell us a little bit about how that is helping your study?
It's early days yet.
Yes.
We are in the process of data collection, but that's the goal. So we have a parallel stream that we are working on as we are collecting data. Some of us, headed by Dr. Schlee, are also looking at how best to analyze the data. So one of the things that you can, and I think your audience can very easily imagine, is that the patients are different. There is, if you meet one person with tinnitus, you've met one person with tinnitus, right? We are so heterogeneous as a patient population. We are also, the different lab setups are different, right? So what I have is very different than what Julia has or Chris has, and all the different ways. And also in Europe, some are within medical establishments. We have different equipment, different ways of presenting sounds, even, and how things are connected. So what machine learning and AI is helping us do is harmonize this data together to make sure all those different disparate sets of data work together and try to get at what is invariant very quickly. Right? We want to pick out the robust signal from all this data. So one of the other efforts here is to simplify things. So the same way maybe ChatGPT will simplify your thoughts and get to the core of things, and will be able to articulate better. So in some ways, what we are trying to do is simplify these robust biomarkers we are trying to find, and say, out of these 5 things, this is what is the most important, and what is perhaps explaining 90% of the variance, or not, is applicable to, let's say, 80 to 90% of the patients, rather than us like trying to do it one step at a time. So it's accelerating some of that. So that's at the data analysis end. So those efforts are in parallel, and they've already started, but they will also come to fruition once data collection has ended.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we're all kind of dying to know as well, kind of what have you learned so far, since you're starting to put all these data together, and since there's always this kind of process in finding that signal in the noise. What have you learned so far about how, the brains of people with tinnitus are actually processing sound a little bit differently from those who do not have tinnitus? What have you gathered? Any highlights? It's also early days.
Yeah, it's also early days, and eventually each site has a different stage of their recruitment, and we're not all, synced with this. And preliminary data, I'd say, with some, we're familiar with one of the paradigms, we call it the gap detection, something that has been developed by Jeremy Turner already 2006 in animal models, but now we're trying to adapt this to humans. and that we do see some patterns that the expected response that would happen in tinnitus people does not, coincide in the proper way. But I don't know, maybe we have to go into the details how this paradigm work, and I don't know if this is suitable in this context. Try to make it simple also. You tell me if this is this is okay.
I mean, I think, yeah, if we
Yeah,
can get
okay.
into some of the details, but try to, kind of keep it in a way that's conversational, I think that would be
Yes.
great.
Okay. So the initial work by Jeremy Turner was to make the hypothesis that if you have an animal on a platform and it has a startle pulse, so a noise that's quite loud, like a clap in the hands, it's 90 decibels, but it's very short in time, so it's not damaging, but makes you startle. You can measure that startle event on a platform. And in humans, you would have a blinking response. People that are surprised by this have a blink. And if you have a continuous sound in the background that's present when you have this pulse, you have this blinking. But if you present a small silent gap just before the startled pulse, then this silent gap makes an inhibition of that reflex response. So it acts like some kind of warning system that tells you, oh, there is something before, you don't need to have this reflex anymore. And so you can change this background frequency to different frequency ranges, whether it's low frequency or super high, so that it gets closer to that of the putative tinnitus one. And the hypothesis that when you have tinnitus, tinnitus interferes with the ability of the gap to make that inhibition. So in a normal individual, you would have a good inhibition. A person without tinnitus wouldn't startle when it's presented that gap and pulse. But someone with tinnitus would react anyhow. And that type of paradigm has been used in the context of schizophrenia, not for diagnosis, but for really good research, understanding of the neural correlates of schizophrenia. It's called prepulse inhibition. Same kind of thing. It's kind of temporal processing. You have information presented in different time sequences, and how is the brain processing this? Now, we've shown that the prepulse type of sound stimuli involves a different brain pathway than the ones with the gap detection. And this is where it's interesting, is that gap detection is all processed in the auditory cortex, which is then at the periphery, where you can have an EEG cap and have sensors that can measure that activity, which is not the case for prepulse inhibition, which is really deep in the brain. So we cannot measure that like that. And so having a brain measure instead of a blinking response, this is super good, because blinking, like maybe 50% of our participants, they don't react to the pulses. So it's a very bad measure of that reactivity to a startle sound. But we see a brain response to a pulse happens all the time. So this is a very good, alternative as a biomarker to measure this. It's much more reliable. And so this is now what we're trying to see. And out of, a first set of 20 people with tinnitus and 20 people without tinnitus, we observe patterns that go in favor of our hypothesis. Now we want to see, if we continue collection and do the other sites also observe the same thing. This is important also to mention, because the artificial intelligence is a way to make this aggregated analysis cohesive. But if you take just one step back, if what we show in Tübingen is replicated in Regensburg and replicated in Dublin, but has some little differences maybe in Illinois or in Texas, we can start understanding how reliable the device is, that approach. But not only reliable, it's having something validated in another center by other people. It's that international validation, not internal, because internal is how you control for things within your lab. This is very important for ensuring, the reliability of your device and your test. So this is something that we can test, because 7 sites operate the same kind of paradigms. We have different devices. If with our device we see something, then Julia finds it also with her different device, then this is a really strong finding. There is something coherent that many people can apply using different settings. And this in the field of tinnitus is very delicate because many of former attempts, for instance, using the auditory brainstem response, which is a standardized clinical measure that is done in ENT clinics, there's been a lot of variability because of the sensitivity of the devices. So some people found some positive associations, others not. So there's been conflicting information. But if there was really something strong, it would be captured by whatever devices. So now we have that constellation of researchers that can also address that type of questions.
Yeah, and I think you've also touched a lot on some of the common challenges in tinnitus research more broadly, but also, actually, I guess more broadly than that, just research overall, trying to kind of get that reliability, replicability, and how things can kind of change from site to site. It sounds like you all are really building a lot of infrastructure around ensuring you can really take charge of those differences and kind of, again, see that signal in the noise. But what other challenges have you encountered kind of in developing the measurements and actually administering them? One example that comes to mind from just like your usual hearing test is, you have to have this hearing test in a small booth, and some people really don't like to be in a small booth environment with no sound whatsoever. You have that tinnitus that might get a little louder in that booth. So you kind of work through that for that particular challenge. But what other challenges kind of come to mind with this research that you're kind of currently working through that maybe folks here should be aware of as well?
I have many things to talk about.
I know there's lots of challenges.
It's taken us more than a year to get to this stage, and countless meetings, bi-weekly meetings, and we have seen each other more than we've seen our relatives sometimes. But it's like, but there was a purpose to this, right? So we worked through inclusion, exclusion criteria, who to include, who to not include. Again, going back to Julia's point about tinnitus being such a heterogeneous population, where do we start? Where do we focus first? As was mentioned, we were testing two paradigms. So one is helmed by Chris and the other by Sven Vaness. And they have published a couple of papers already, and they have found there's another school of thought about predictive coding that we see a lot in terms of all neuroscience and how we process either sounds or pictures. We expect something, and if that expectation is not present, it's a novelty, we generate an error, and we measure that error signal. So the other paradigm is leveraging that. So when someone is expecting silence, but if they have tinnitus, and of course there is no silence, right? So we set up some predictions for it, and we are trying to address some of that. And they have published quite a few papers on that. And this goes back to, I think, even 15, 20 years, there was a movement in cognitive neuroscience about understanding how we process any stimuli, right? How do we process touch? How do we process vision? How do we process hearing? And we're leveraging some of this basic knowledge about how a brain just works. And we are leveraging that to understand in the case of tinnitus, and can we use that as a test, so to speak, differentiating tinnitus from controls. So I just wanted to make sure we close the story on that and not leave it hanging, because yes, we have two different approaches that we are doing. We're also doing resting state, for instance, which is one of the tasks we do. And so we have a lot of rich data. And one of the things I think we also struggle with, from very simple thing like naming the files, as in from the different centers, and that took over a meeting or two, and then the different data sets, and make sure they're uploaded at the right time, at the right place. There are also institutional approvals, right? Every university, every medical center will have their own institutional approvals that we have to go through, the ethics board, in order to test human participants. And we had different stories with that. Some were 3 months, some were 6 months, and it's a long process. And this is a good process. We do need this kind of approval to make sure we are doing everything carefully, we are doing everything correctly. And again, there are other legal issues as well with contract signing and getting funding, and this varies. And this is, again, Rainwater Foundation has a lot of experience with it, but then we always brought in some new things just to make things interesting. So that was that also was very new, right, for a number of us, and I'm sure for the foundation. And we had to work through all of that in order to begin data collection. So we began at the same time, nearly within a very, I think, window from 1 month to 2 months. Everybody has begun data collection, right? And we are taking different paths. Some of us are slower than others, but it varies because Julia and I are doing within a university system. Chris as well. I think some others are doing within a medical center, and those have slightly different things. So a lot of bureaucracy has been learning. We have learned so much about different bureaucracy, is what I can tell you.
Yeah. There's a lot of kind of internal support that's needed from universities in order to be able to kind of move some of that work forward. And oftentimes with with funding, that can be kind of difficult to obtain. So. And you also kind of touched on the nature of kind of this international collaboration. I think that's really wonderful. It also kind of brings along some challenges, kind of moving between different countries and their different systems. Has that been a particular challenge for you, or have you, maybe your team is kind of more aware of those challenges and can kind of navigate them a little more smoothly? How's that international aspect kind of serving as both a benefit and potentially, kind of provides a little more work to do? What are your thoughts there?
Oh,
Julia, you take it.
Yeah, Julia.
Keep talking enough.
Oh dear.
Oh, dear.
I mean, there's a funny story where one of our sites is it New Zealand, I think, or Belgium, needed another expert to come help, and there was a whole visa situation where that person couldn't necessarily travel there. And so there's things like that where traveling to get to one another can be difficult. I know for us, we have very different equipment from a lot of the sites. And so, getting that coding up to run the experiments and getting that calibration correct was difficult because we weren't able to have that in-person support. And I am a clinician. I'm not a computer scientist by any means. So that's been interesting. But honestly, I think I've really been happy with how our universities, and I think Fatima's had a very similar experience, how open they are to have this data sharing. That has not been a challenge, and that's been very encouraging. And Rainwater very much wants this to be open data that other researchers can access. And so that's actually been easier than expected. So that's been one thing that's been simpler, which is nice.
And I'm curious, just as a quick follow, why is it important to have those data accessible at the end? You all are going to be analyzing it. What benefit does it have to have this data accessible to others?
I think, sorry, Chris, you go ahead. I'm totally monopolizing.
Well, it's okay. I think there are aspects of first replication. There's another thing. If we have the data that's available out there, someone else might run it, perform the same analysis, and end up with something a little different. I would say, okay, maybe you forgot a comma here and there, and that would be the output. But people can also improve it. So if you have the data alone doesn't help. You need also all your codes and all your analysis, how you've done it, so people can try to go beyond what you have. So that's one thing. The other one is about aggregating data together. So now there is a way that you can perform systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And typically now people have been doing this, but at a group level. So you take a publication and you have the statistics of the overall group, 120 people reacted like this. But you don't get this finite resolution of, this granular information that can help you just merging multiple data sets with individual data together. And then your statistical power is better because you're able to picture everything globally with all the small details that you're missing when you're just picking up aggregated data. So there is also something like this that is interesting and important, that when you share that data, people can use it, because if they run their experiment on their side, they can start merging things together. When you have group data, it's harder. And I would say a third one, which I think is valuable, is education, because this is something, the tinnitus field is small. And if you put codes and data there, people in labs can start using it to try to teach their staff how to do the things. And it helps them also reproduce the methodology. So we're doing the same measures, but we analyze it the same way. We understand what we should get as an outcome. And that training could help other centers to also implement the same type of paradigms in their centers faster. So you don't need necessarily to go in all of the sites around the world to train. If someone has knowledge on coding, they can get these things and get that up and running in their lab also. And this provocates, a major advancement in the field, but globally. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a really
And
good
just to second the last point of Chris, so the tinnitus research world, and certainly the tinnitus clinical world, is way beyond the 7 centers, right? So one of the things we want to do is make this data available to others, and it will last way beyond our careers, right? So one of the things I think we've learned in the past few years, especially with the onset of the COVID pandemic, is that if something were to happen to any one of our labs, we still want that we've learned to exist in the world and to accelerate and continue to propagate itself within the scientific world, right? It shouldn't be that one lab closes and that should be the end of it, right? So data we've collected, sometimes in this case very heroically, we want that to be available, and then also the scripts or the analysis pipeline we're developing, or this capacity we're building about it, should also be available and will sort of accelerate research down the line beyond these 2 years we have for this project.
Yeah, and I have to commend you all on your thoughtfulness in ensuring that these data do live beyond the project, because I think smaller scale projects, you might have kind of a more finite short term point of view, but it really sounds like you all are thinking about this as a long term, future looking project that really I think is going to serve as a really great foundation for more. So I think kind of thinking of that, let's think about kind of the future and kind of where this work is going. If you could wave your magic wand and in 20 years, the study has done everything that you wanted, how would this research actually change the way that we practice clinically, perform our research related to tinnitus and maybe the hearing field as well, and other things that you might that is not coming to mind for me right now, other things that you might find in 20 years if this all goes the way that you would love it to? It's a magic wand, so it's hard to kind of envision.
I have a dream personally.
Excellent.
My utopia vision would be that we would have a battery of measures at different levels of the central auditory system, and somebody who has tinnitus can come in and receive that battery of measures, and those can pick out what deficits or atypical function is contributing to their tinnitus. Maybe it's a combination, maybe one is more weighted than the other, and then we can say, for example, you should have vagal nerve stimulation to treat this. If somebody has a different pattern of contributing function, we might have a pharmaceutical approach. So basically, a personalized testing, battery, and treatment approach, that would be the dream.
That makes sense, especially considering the heterogeneity in the group, right? It kind of sounds like you'd want to figure out, what that individual specific kind of diagnoses are, how they kind of subgroup, and then map them to a treatment that is known maybe to work for that type of profile. Is that kind of the idea?
Mhm. And just as one more little thing I want to add is, and these treatment options are cost effective, right? There are 750 million individuals that we think have tinnitus, right? That is what the latest studies are showing. That's a huge number around the world, and not everyone can afford this very top of the line, right? So the only addendum I'll add to Julia's thing, which I completely agree with 100%, is that it'd be cost effective, and then we are gold.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of that is, our current clinical approach is you start with kind of the most cost effective and kind of broadest perspective in terms of, what could be effective, and then you kind of step up from there. But if you know from your diagnostics that, maybe the white noise at night isn't enough, and maybe the hearing aids, need a little bit more than that. Maybe you could skip a few steps and actually get there a little faster. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. But I think also for making that to happen, Rebecca, there is a need for the ENT clinics to broaden up the scope of what they have. Many now, I would say, they're focusing on peripheral hearing, but not necessarily also the brain processes that happen there. So that's the weakness for tinnitus. Tinnitus is, it's multidisciplinary. You have ear, you have brain neurology, you have tensions in the jaw, so that's somatosensory, and you have psychology as well. So that involves a lot of different domains, and the ENT clinics have feared, exploring these aspects because they don't masterize it. And I think that is now the time for them to start exploring. And the last thing is biobanking. Having a notion, the fact that severe tinnitus runs in families. Nobody's asking this when someone comes with severe tinnitus. Do you have any other member of your family that also suffers from this? Yes. What we've seen is in the Swedish population, the risk is as high as for schizophrenia. So it's very big odds. But nobody is, questioning this. That this is like a zone like that. So our findings need to be replicated elsewhere. But if it does, then having a small sample of blood from which you can get DNA and start understanding that subtyping, so the classification of people depending on their type of tinnitus. If you have that genetic biomarker to reinforce your presumptions based on the brain signals, then you can really direct them, as Julia was mentioning before, to a targeted treatment, but increasing the chances that this would work for that patient. So ENT clinics need to broaden up and embrace the fantastic multidisciplinarity of their domain. Tinnitus offers this, and that's quite unique. Other disease areas don't have that, but I think the more complex it is, and the more you can collaborate with different partners and entities, and the more it's becoming interesting also.
Yeah.
I completely agree with Chris. I think that's such a great insight. I remember being in my externship as a graduate student, and a young man came in with really severe tinnitus, and I watched the ENT tell him there's nothing we can do. And that's not true, first of all. And I just think that the medical profession, just like Chris said, needs to start broadening their viewpoint on tinnitus and look for more answers with us and support us. If you have a patient that comes in with tinnitus and you don't know what to do, look for a nearby university or a lab to send them to that's specializing in this research that might be able to give them more information. I just think that's critical. So I'm glad. Thank you, Chris, for saying that.
Yeah, and I'll also mention that, the ATA, the American Tinnitus Association, is a really great resource for kind of those general resources that people can provide to their patients and other people who, would benefit from that information. So, reaching out to local universities, local universities are great. ATA is a great source of information. And the ATA also has a one-time advisors call that people can use just to kind of help guide their path if they're feeling a little bit stuck. So I totally agree with you. It'd be great to make sure that all of our kind of healthcare partners are kind of, with the latest information in terms of what can be done. And, being able to have some partnerships with people like the ATA and universities are certainly going to be helpful with that as well.
Thanks for that shout out, Becky. I as the CEO of the ATA, we're just a public charity trying to serve folks with tinnitus. So if folks ever do have questions, it's a great point. They can call us anytime on our 800 line, 1-800-634-8978 here in the US. I'm looking at the comments. We have viewers from literally all over the world right now. So you guys have been really insightful for a lot of people literally around the world. But of course, ata.org also exists as a really great resource for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I know there are a lot of questions. Maybe now would be, I have one maybe quick follow-up question on exactly what we were talking about. I know we're talking more about ear, nose, and throat physicians at this point, and thinking about how many ear, nose, and throat physicians there are, how many audiologists there are, and then comparing that with how many general practitioners or kind of primary care physicians there might be. Could you imagine, trying to partner with more primary care or general practitioners to try to provide some of that information as well? And kind of what all could you imagine with that?
And I think just to add to what has been discussed here, Becky, it's like in different countries, they have slightly different framework. I know in France, for instance, the ENTs work a lot with patients with tinnitus because they don't really have a doctor of audiology program, for instance. So it's a very different framework. So I collaborate with an ENT clinic in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and that has been a very fruitful collaboration for me because the way they have approached tinnitus has been so interesting and so useful, and the treatment options that they provide there. So I think maybe we step back and take a broader look about it, and with ATA and other similar organizations around the world. So going back to our utopian dream, and maybe all of those tinnitus associations around the world can also come together and do this kind of interprofessional education, if per se, like taking what is in the research labs and deployed more quickly in the clinical world. And I know the same thing that Julie has experienced about there's nothing we can do is being said as of now in February 2025, right? That hasn't ended. And unfortunately, that's something that we really need to work with. And as I look to your organization and other organizations to say, how do we deploy that knowledge quicker and faster in the clinical world, not just to our patients? Chris.
Yes, in that regard, we've been working with Rilana Sima, that was 2014, and developing some European guidelines on how to assess and how to handle tinnitus. We need that updated, but not all countries do that. So that's a weakness. But the idea with European guidelines is that it spreads, across the different continent, but then the Americans also have their own guidelines there. And this is a first way to start informing really everybody. These guidelines need to be updated with the most recent research. There's been a lot of clinical trials ongoing with devices. We talked about vagus nerve stimulation. There is also bimodal stimulation. There are alternatives coming up with greater sample-sized trials that are ongoing. And if we can come up also with a method that can quantify this in the clinic, that's rather straightforward, then that would be a first way to spread the information. But as you say, Rebecca, if the GPs are not aware that this is happening, they might not refer people to the appropriate centers. So this is where there is a big amount of work to go to the basics, and that's education also at the universities where people are trained to become doctors. So they are away. That's what I do in Sweden. I tell them about what is happening in tinnitus, and hopefully some of those will become ENT doctors that will know about it. And this is a nice way to slide the information in.
If I could just interject with one quick question as the patient advocate here, and probably the least, I'm the only non-PhD here. But you all have mentioned a couple of times here, Christopher, I heard you mention schizophrenia, for example. And over the last few months, I've heard words like dementia. And so we're here in the context of biomarkers and a biomarker study, but maybe a couple of you could speak to the audience a little bit more about the what we know for sure as a fact about any connection, yes or no, as it relates to schizophrenia or dementia for us real quickly, if that's even something we could address quickly. But I know there's a few folks in the comments who are asking that same question.
Yes, I've done some epidemiology in the Swedish data sets, and I haven't found any relationship with schizophrenia. Usually people with severe tinnitus don't have these other neurological disorders. Dementia is a broad name that encompasses a lot of different subforms of problems like Alzheimer's and things like that do they are related in some way with hearing loss. People have shown, that if you have some decline in hearing, then you have increased likelihood to have some pre-Alzheimer symptoms. This is still debated. There is a lot of information going on, but there is increased awareness about that. The people with the dementia field acknowledge that hearing loss is one of the major risk factors, modifier risk factors for dementia. Now, for what happens with those with tinnitus, it's still unclear. So there's a need for more analysis in that particular area to make that correlation.
Yeah, I think just to point out, about 90% of individuals with tinnitus will also have some form of clinically significant hearing loss, but the reverse is not true, right? So if you take 100 people with hearing loss, only about 50 of them will have tinnitus. So a lot of these studies that Chris is citing have only considered hearing loss, have not asked the follow-up question, do you have tinnitus? So we are running a bit blind here. There have been smaller studies that are beginning to look at hearing loss plus tinnitus and its impact. And when we have done that in large-scale studies, not with respect to hearing, we as in the field, not with respect to memory issues, but just in general, like the centralized database, the NANS database, and so on, we are actually finding that having tinnitus in addition to hearing loss can give you a little bit of boost in cognitive testing. So these are very, very preliminary research. Some older studies have showed that if you have tinnitus, then you may be poorer at cognitive testing, but newer ones are showing maybe they're better. So this is a story that is yet to unfold. So at the current moment, there is nothing that you can take to the bank, as they say.
Thank you. One other question that we're getting from the audience, Becky, I want to toss it back to you because you're the moderator here. But one question we got here earlier in the chat was from Mark Pertain, and he's wondering, in terms of biomarkers and tracking tinnitus perception, how maybe we could speak a little bit more about. Let me see if I'm reading this question correctly. How would a biomarker for tinnitus view the presence of tinnitus, but not distress over tinnitus, if that question makes any sense?
Completely. That's a very important question because when we participated with Deborah Hall in a study to try to figure out what would be the best outcome measures for depending on the intervention, if you have a drug device or you have a neurological device or you have psychological support, then you want different outcomes. But if you have a drug or a neurological device, you want to measure tinnitus presence, but independent of that severity signal, the psychological domain that you have, which is where with the gap detection, we're focusing on the auditory cortex, which we believe would have a signal response, not necessarily dependent on the psychological burden that's there. It's more about tinnitus loudness itself. Now we need the results from TIDE to be able to confirm this, but that's our assumption. At least for the gap detection, it would be independent of that. Maybe Fatima can answer more about the predictive coding and how symptoms of depression and stress and anxiety can impact on those measures with the other
Yeah.
part.
I commend the commenter. This is a very important question that we as a field have also been trying to grapple with it and convey to others outside the field, right? So those who are not working in tinnitus, but let's say are neuroscientists, they don't quite grasp that. They think it's only just tinnitus means just hearing the sound and that's it, and nothing else happens. And then, right? And we know that the impact on the individual is very much a part of it. And how do we sort of divorce that? And is it possible even to do that? What I remember reading from the predictive coding, again, this is Sven Vinest's lab's work, is that they can, the degree of errors that they are seeing, or the degree of performance, let's say they are seeing in the tasks and in the EEG, so to speak, is correlated with the degree of distress. So that's one thing to think about. So maybe we are seeing more clearly the biomarker. If we have more distress, that can be one way of considering it. But again, it remains to be seen. So a lot of the brain is interconnected. Not one region is an island in itself. Much like we all hold multitudes. The same way. I think tinnitus itself is part of this. I know there have been some large-scale studies of genes, for instance, which point to tinnitus also overlapping with hearing loss and with a lot of other psychological disorders as well. So we have to keep that in mind. At any given moment, we will view it from a certain lens, but then, a week later, we can view it from a different lens, but altogether we'll put it right for the requirements of a particular experiment or project. We may be viewing it with a certain lens, but it exists in its complexity, if that makes sense. And eventually, the research world will come to that understanding, if that makes sense. But yeah, we're trying to get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. To follow up on that, Sven's work has shown that there are specific networks related to loudness of tinnitus or distress of tinnitus. So it's important that we, we have questionnaires and such that really encapsulate the multifaceted experience of tinnitus. And we are doing that in TIDE. So we are looking at all these aspects of tinnitus, distress and loudness and whatnot. And it is possible that the signals that we're recording from the brain might correlate more strongly with some of these different factors. But that's something that we're going to look at.
And I want to make sure we also, we're talking more about our research project today and kind of the potential future of that research and kind of where we're hoping for that to go. There's also recognizing that future pathway with our current state. There was a comment in the chat where there was some concern around not being referred for an EEG with tinnitus. Could you talk a little bit about maybe what the expectations would be in terms of diagnostics for tinnitus today versus what you all are kind of proposing kind of in the future?
I can talk about what we do in the clinic at Texas.
Okay. Perfect.
So we have two different ways to diagnose tinnitus depending on if the patient has hearing loss or not. If they don't have any hearing loss in the clinical frequency range that we typically do a hearing test in, we'll test extended high frequencies. We'll also look at otoacoustic emissions to see how the outer hair cells are functioning, which tends to be more sensitive to subclinical hearing damage. For those with hearing loss, we'll do the full typical battery. And then we also do a tinnitus assessment where we look at things like loudness, pitch matching, things of that nature. EEG is not a clinical practice currently. That's what we're hoping to implement with this study. So it would be a research measure, but that is something, again, that we're hoping comes out of this study, that it would be clinical practice.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that there are so many technical advancements now ongoing that there would be a chance, I would say, even in, you're talking about the 20 years ahead of us, that there are EEG portable devices that you could put there relatively cheap, and you could have some headphones that send you the sounds, and you could have a home toolkit for diagnostics, for instance. And there you could use it to assess treatment effects and so on. So I think that in 20 years from now, technology will advance in such a way that with a portable phone and an iPhone, you could control your little EEG mini cap and make some kind of assessment about the status you have there, and then upon the advice of a doctor, which treatment helps you and how. And this data would be going back to the doctor that can follow you up and make sure that everything is fine.
Yeah. And that actually, someone, Mark Pertain, also commented in the chat about the potential for bio-tracking. And, today we have some certain kind of trackers that we could use with smartwatches and kind of other wearables. You've kind of imagined this little mini EEG that you could kind of port around with you. How do you see bio-tracking, especially on kind of a day-to-day basis, as something that could, certainly benefit your study and then also patients with tinnitus just more generally? And maybe we'll take a frame of today's devices versus maybe the 20 years from now devices.
So just to clarify, so are we talking about bio-tracking as in measuring just your stress levels, or I had to remove my watch?
Yeah.
But right, your blood pressure and that kind of, is that what we are talking? Are we talking about in terms of apps that ping you and ask you, how is your tinnitus right now? Which are also, there are apps, right, on the phone which will randomly ping you, or you can set it and say, how do I feel today? How do I feel when I wake up at 7 a.m. versus when I go to bed and a different time? So there are different ways of looking at it. I know there has been one strand of research in tinnitus and stress, and that could be, I think, would be something that we can leverage down the line with these kind of tracking and seeing if that changes, right? When we know this, right? And our patients tell us if they're going through a very stressful period, their tinnitus seems louder, right? And they have trouble sleeping, then they have this, right? And then the more they worry about the tinnitus, the more stress they get. And so that, right? So I don't think currently we have the technology to correlate that with the tinnitus as yet. There are ways perhaps to think about it. What I think is important is there are already existing technology to tell us when we are in a loud environment, right? So that's something that the students, for instance, I'm surrounded by students, sorry, young people, the apps will tell them, oh, look, I'm in this very loud cafeteria, I'm in this very loud part of my campus, or so on. They have those tracking, and then they adjust accordingly, right? So some of individuals with tinnitus also have hyperacusis, and that's an issue as well, right? You have sensitivity to loudness of everyday sounds, even just slightly above. And that's very common comorbidity with tinnitus. And will that exacerbate their own tinnitus if they're exposed to loud sounds and they adjust themselves? Oh, I'm listening to very loud music. And your app will tell you this is too loud for you. This environment is too loud. And maybe that it's sort of an indirect tracking is what I think is currently possible. I don't know if Chris and Julia think of how we can imagine a very specific tracking of our own tinnitus. I don't know.
And if that's something you would recommend, really.
It depends on the person. Sometimes thinking too much about tinnitus is also not a good thing, as Julia will tell you, because then you go into this feedback loop of constantly thinking about your tinnitus and worrying about it. I think it's okay to have apps which alert you when you are in a loud environment. And then that's, I think, for all of us, whether we have tinnitus or not, I think it's good not to be exposed to loud sounds and impulse type sounds, and to be made aware of it. If we are so focused on something else, we are not registering how loud things are. And for young people and their concerts and whatever, it's a good idea. And even gyms can be very loud. Sorry, the Zumba music can be extremely loud.
Yeah, they really can. Absolutely. It's good to kind of protect hearing and make sure that we're taking steps today to kind of prevent any future issues from cropping up when we can. I personally love the noise notifications. It's like, oh, great, I didn't have this before. So we'll look forward to kind of more tools in the future. I guess kind of bringing it back to, we were kind of looking at some of the questions in the chat, but bringing it back to really, your project and looking forward about what you all are most excited about. It's a clinical trial, so I think you're hoping for additional recruitments. But what specific ways could folks who are actually listening to this call today, how can they support you? How can they support your work? How can they support, advancing really this tinnitus research? Are there certain ways that you'd love to have people get involved?
I think in the US, if you're close enough to Champaign-Urbana, you're very welcome to join our project. We are looking for both participants with tinnitus and also controls without, and this is one of the ways we are testing the paradigms. So if you're within driving distance, and we are extremely grateful for all of our volunteers, and some are driving long distances to come see us. And this is an in-lab study and not online, so they need to come to where we are located. And I think same with Julia and Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
We are in Illinois, so Chris,
or you
want to fly to Tübingen, Germany?
Sounds like fun.
No, one thing that can be really interesting is for the participants with tinnitus to potentially have their siblings coming in too, because they might have someone in the family that doesn't have it. It's the same age range, could be opposite sex, same sex, but that balances well in terms of aging, because this is also something that's quite difficult, and depending on the setting, if you have a clinic that has a lot of patients with tinnitus, it's very hard to find the controls that have the same age range, same type of hearing loss, but without the tinnitus, that could be tricky. So if you have a sibling that would want to help out, that is a perfect scenario.
Yeah, and really, I think that also underlines the importance of just communicating with others that this is something that is ongoing, and that not necessarily keeping it to yourself, because I think everyone just wants kind of the best for people, right? So if you can kind of broaden your social circle and say, this is what I'm participating in, wouldn't it be great if you participated too? I'm sure that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, we get a lot of spouses, Chris, so that's always we do get, so if it is the husband or the wife,
excellent. I'm gonna
because the siblings sometimes may live far away, but we get a better hit rate with asking about spouses, and they tend to be very
very good.
Wonderful. Well, I know we have taken a good portion of your time for this morning. So I just want to thank everyone for their time. And I know that this is the beginning of your journey as well, right? So there's going to be so much more to come from the TIDE project, certainly from all of you, and absolutely from the ATA as well. So thank you for joining us for this session today. I'll hand it over back to Patrick, maybe for some closing thoughts.
We would love to come back in a year's time for the next Tinnitus Awareness Week and talk to you about our results. So,
if that's a promise, we'll give you the platform, Doctor. Yes. That sounds absolutely fantastic. I can't thank all of you enough. This, as a patient advocate, I was told, over 25 years ago, learn to live with it. And the founder of the ATA was told the very same thing. And so just to hear this conversation from thought leaders like yourselves, to know that there's an organization like the Rainwater Charitable Fund interested in something like this, gives me hope, simply as a patient, let alone as the CEO of a charity focused on this. So that's a bet. We will do this a year from now, and we'll have some great follow-up questions. To the folks in the comments, thank you for being a part. We've had some incredible, it's Super Bowl Sunday here in the US, and we've had over 300 folks watching this for over an hour straight. So there are folks who are interested, and this will live on YouTube and the other platforms. But in the meantime, I want to thank all of you, Becky, Julia, Fatima, and Christopher. It's really moving to hear from our end. And folks, if you're watching and would like to learn more, you can always visit our website, ata.org. And if you're so moved We are a public charity. We can only do things like this because of the donations that come our way. We want to fund more research ourselves, but we cannot give what we do not have. And much like the name of this project, the Tide Project, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So if you'd like to be a part of this mission, if you want to help silence tinnitus, we would be honored if you consider a gift to the American Tinnitus Association. You can scan this QR code with your phone or visit ata.org now. But for now, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tide Project. Thank you, Amy, earlier in the discussion for introducing yourself, and Becky, thank you for moderating. If folks ever have questions, visit us on ata.org and follow us on social. But we'll do this again in a year.
And thank you to Joy and Bryce in the background for helping us and setting this up. Thank you, Joy.
Yes, a small but mighty team. We're so grateful.
Exactly.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Becky.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you all again very soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.